Hi, I'm Salan Bidwan, and this is a special feature of International EYEZ. Today I would like to talk about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and America's perception of what's going on, and just talk about the history, the conflict, what can happen from here, and basically give us all a little bit of knowledge as Americans that we can make a well-informed opinion of what's happening. So first let me introduce my guest today. I have Rajai Kubain, who is the president of the North Carolina Triangle Chapter of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, as well as chair of the Palestinian Right of Return Coalition North Carolina Committee, also known as Al-Alda, and Rania Masri, who is the co-chair of the Media Committee of Al-Alda, which is, again, the Palestinian Right of Return Coalition, as well as the national board member of Peace Action. Rajai, I'll let you both tell us a little bit about yourselves and let us know what you're doing in the community.
All right. My name is Rajai Kubain. I'm a Palestinian. I immigrated to the United States in 1975, where I received my undergraduate and graduate education in Northern Virginia. I moved to North Carolina about 10 years ago, and I've worked for several years now with the Arab community, trying to really promote their rights and their perspectives for as difficult of a time that the Arab community gets with the stereotyping and the misinformation and really the bad image that they get in the media. It's very difficult for the community to survive here in the United States, and it's a message that really needs to go out to Americans, and we have worked hard to try to bring it forth.
Well, my name is Rania Masri. I moved to North Carolina in '86 and have been living here for 14.5 years now. I'm a peace activist first, and a human rights activist, definitely. Most of my time I spend working on two issues, the first being the right of return for all Palestinian refugees to their homeland, which is Palestine, and the second being ending the 10-year-long war on the 22 million people of Iraq.
Thank you, and thank you for joining us today. First, let's talk about some common impressions that we Americans have of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I know one is that Israel, I've always heard, you know that Israel is a big democracy and the only true democracy in the Middle East, and that's why it's important for us as Americans to support them and support their democracy. And that's why the U.S. is such a strong ally of Israel. Some other things.
I think the American public always sees Palestinians and Arabs on TV somehow labeled and genetic flawed to be terrorist people that want to kill, people that want to incite violence, and that somehow we have to be careful of terrorism, try to control it, suppress it, and support the powers, the true democratic powers of Israel, the civil society somehow that is right, and us as Americans need to provide support for them. I think that's often what Americans see on the media, and maybe here today we'll have an opportunity to show another side of it.
Yeah, let me just add one thing. The definition of democracy in all the books is that all citizens of that nation must have equal and legitimate rights under law. Using that code, Israel is not a democracy. Israel is an apartheid state. Because as a Jew, you would have rights under law. As a non-Jew in Israel, you would have secondary or even tertiary rights under law. Therefore, it cannot be a democracy because all the citizens of the country are not treated equally, do not have equal rights in any way whatsoever. It is a democracy only for the Jews of that country. But all the other citizens of that country, it is not a democracy.
I think often you see maybe this is a religious conflict, that somehow it's the terrorist Muslims doing their jihad, which is somehow associated with terrorism and with killing people, and somehow we need to be careful to protect the security of the attacked Israel or other countries, or Americans, that is, as you see in examples on the news, to be protected from these fanatical Muslims. And this is far from the truth, and I hope today we'll have an opportunity to dispel some of this.
Yes, and that's our intention, to dispel some of the myths and and reveal the facts so that you can make your own informed decision about what's happening. Let's start by taking the opportunity to explore some of the history of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Why don't we start well, with Zionism? I know Zionism is a word, one of those phrases that you hear a lot. Why don't we talk about what that is, its origins, and how it has affected the goings-on in the Middle East?
Sure, that's true, Salam. This all really started by something called Zionism. Zionism is a movement that arose in Europe in the late 1800s, and it was a concept for the creation of a Jewish state, a country that's based on a religion. And as you can see, and as my colleague here pointed out earlier, is that this is discrimination at its basis to define a country where its citizens are valued by the religion. This movement was looking around the world for a plot of land, for an area where a Jewish country was to be created. Two of the areas that were looked at more seriously were Argentina and were Palestine. The Jews do have some roots in Palestine that date back to the 2,000 years to Christ and some of the history in that area. As part of this decision, as part of this movement, there were organizations created in Europe that tried to influence the immigration of thousands of Jews to the land of Palestine. In 1880, at the time, Palestine was a land that was under the administration, part of the Ottoman Empire. At the time, there were only 24,000 Jews in the area. There were 800,000 Palestinians. The Jews were approximately 3% of the population. And from then through the years, again and again, Jews would be enticed to migrate to Palestine, to attempt the purchase of the land. And the Ottoman Empire would persist again and again to stop this, to facilitate the migration of Jews, but not in mass numbers and not for the purpose of the creation of a state, for this was a country of its people, and most of the people of that country were really Palestinians.
But for years, from 1880 on, for years, while there were 3% and growing of Jews in Palestine, they lived in peace for many years. Is that right?
They sure did. My mother tells me in many of these stories, she said, we lived side by side, and we got along well. And there were problems. As the amount of immigration grew, as the dominance of the Jews was coming in, the Palestinians could see and knew from their papers, from their books, from their organizations, that their objective was really to create a Jewish state where the Palestinians would have no place. And they started rising up, but they didn't have the opportunity. And as you see, as we come along to World War I, things would start changing. And I can speak a minute about that. There would be World War I, and that's about 1913. At the end of World War I, essentially the Ottoman Empire was ousted from the land of Palestine, and the Palestinians would be under what's called a British mandate. Meanwhile, and even before, during the Ottoman Empire, the Jews in Europe had a strong political influence on the European governments, and would influence through that relationship, pressure on the Ottoman Empire to facilitate the migration of Jews into Palestine. And this would continue in a more significant way once the British occupied Palestine. And we have in 1917 where Lord Balfour would sign a declaration facilitating for the creation of Israel and providing for even much larger mass immigration of Jews. And during this occupation of Palestinians, any uprising through the Palestinians, through a movement, would be oppressed and would be snuffed out, while the Jews would be allowed to build a militia, bring in military, train and exercise, and be in a position to actually attack when they did. And you see this leading up to 1947. leading up to 1947, World War II, there would be skirmishes between the Jewish militia and Britain, and Britain would have a very difficult time with this and would come to the United Nations and say, the United Nations was just newly born, and would come to the United Nations and would say, United Nations, please resolve this, because we have a difficult time controlling this and knowing what the solution is. And maybe Rania can share with us a little bit of what happened then.
Well, what the United Nations did, and at that time it was called the League of Nations, was they basically divided Palestine. Now, let's put this in perspective. We had a lot of migration from outside the area. So a lot of people, primarily from European descent, were coming into Palestine. They were coming in armed. There were already a lot of violence that was being committed. And then we had the United Nations, okay, people again in Europe, deciding that the land of Palestine must be divided. So basically, if you were a Palestinian, what happened was your house is now cut in half. Basically, that is that. We had the land of Palestine that was cut up, 55.6% to be exact, was given to the Jews. Naturally, the Palestinians rejected this since, number one, the Jews were the minority in population, they were the minority in landowners, and nobody would accept the idea of half their land being taken away. There are two myths that are commonly said about Israel that unfortunately are believed. Number one is that this is a people with no nation for a nation with no people. We have heard that a lot of times, and this is completely false. According to the Israelis themselves, and I'm quoting an Israeli leader when he says here, there is no Zionism, colonization, or Jewish state without the eviction of the Arabs and the expropriation of their lands. In other words, every Israeli city that you see, every Jewish city that you see in Israel is built upon the remnants of Palestinian cities and Palestinian villages. Every single one without exception. So the first myth is completely false. The second myth that we hear a lot about is that Israel had to defend itself against aggressors in 1947 and 1948. We hear that all the time. They are a victimized nation surrounded by enemies. 2 points here. Number one, the massacres that were committed against Palestinians, the immense ethnic cleansing that took place when we had 800,000 Palestinians evicted from their homes in 1947 and 1948, 70% of them evicted at gunpoint. All this took place before any Arab country tried to protect the Palestinians. All this took place before the State of Israel was officially declared. We had the mass ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. Still till now, Israel is presented as a victim, although Israel is the strongest military state in the entire Middle East. Israel is the only country with nuclear weapons in the Middle East. And so we still have this propagation of this is a victimized people and a victimized state. History says completely otherwise.
Yeah, just to fill in a few facts with what Rania was just speaking about. When the State of Israel was created, the United Nations would give it 56% of the land. The concept was to create this country, but to facilitate and allow for its citizens to stay in the towns and their villages and to live as they have always had. But unfortunately, the Jewish organizations that would create the state would have a different concept. They wanted a state that was for Jews, that was simply about religion and a people of the religion, and therefore would go through and would ethnically cleanse, as my colleague here says, Palestine. They did this in multiple ways. They went in and they took over some towns and they had massacres. We have the town of Deir Yassin, where they tied up people, paraded them around the town and then massacred them. We have the town of Tantura, where they took all the men, they had them dig a large ditch, and then they shot most of them and had the rest of them bury them, the few left. There's a story about a son actually burying his father alive. And then they would go back and they would tell the rest of the town, and the stories would spread. And that would really scare Palestinians. Many of them would flee, knowing that this terrorism and this slaughtering was coming to them. In many more towns, a larger percentage, the Israeli militia would occupy the town, and then they would put them in trucks, and they would take them to the border, or actually in even more In more cases, they would gather them, they would talk to the leadership, and they would say, that direction, start moving. And there's stories of people dying as they are traveling, trying to get to another town, as you would know of the trails of tears. And people were just left to die. And that's really what the creation of Israel is about. 800,000 Palestinians would be refugeed. 100,000 of them would be allowed to remain in Israel, but 40,000 of them, 40% of them, would actually be expelled and out of their homes. People lost their homes, people lost all their possessions. There's the story of my grandparents and my mother, where in the town of Beisan, they would occupy the town, they would put them on the truck, and they would lose everything. My grandfather, within a year, would die from being despair and being destitute in their situation. So this is really what happened, and this is how we come about of Palestinian refugees and these Palestinian camps, refugee camps that you hear about continuously. There are 5 million Palestinians today as refugees, and as we go on with some of this history, we'll find out how even more of them will refugees in the future.
You paint a very vivid picture. A lot of the images, like you said, the leading them out are very similar to the way the Native Americans in this country were led in the Trail of Tears when they were sent out of their land, as well as, and then the story about the ditches and the shooting and the burying, like some of the Nazi war footage that you see that the Jews suffered themselves many years ago. The images that many of us Americans are familiar with, and then you don't think of these things happening. Mostly in the media, you see are portrayed as the Palestinians as the attackers and the Israelis as the victims, whereas you just clarified that Israel is almost as powerful as the United States when it comes to the army and the nuclear weapons and that sort of thing. Let's bring it up in time. 1967, the next major point in history of events between the Palestinians and Israelis. What happened then?
Well, before we jump to 67, let me just say one more thing about 48, that I think we really, 48 is such an important time in our history. We even call it in Arabic the catastrophe. We had 418 Palestinian villages decimated in 1 year. Decimated. 418 villages decimated. The majority of the Palestinians at that time were made into refugees. So if we remember that, we remember these people were pushed out, continued to be pushed out. And then we had the 67 war, which Rajai will talk about briefly. But we need to keep that very much in mind, that the state of Israel was created on the lands of others. It was created by dispossessing people of their land, dispossessing people of their rights, and committing numerous massacres from 1947 to 1950 and until today.
Yeah, with regards to the 418 villages that Rania spoke about, this is again a fact and a statement showing what the vision was of the creation of Israel. The idea was to snuff out any existence of Palestinians in that area, and therefore they went ahead and they bombed. They actually demolished and tried to wipe out these towns, 418 of them. And we have many Palestinians of my friends will go back with their parents and they will find the town and they will find the rubble of where they lived. But going on to 1967, this is quite fast forward. There would be a 6-day war. Israel would first, under growing tensions between the countries there, and many reasons why the growing tension is because back again to 1948, the United Nations put up a resolution 194, that called for the immediate return of the refugees and the restoration of their homes and their valuables. And here we were many years later, and that would not happen. In 1967, Israel would attack Egypt. To give you a sense of what's going on, actually, in 1948, again, we keep going back, the state of Israel was given by the United Nations 56% of the land. They would actually take much more.
Yes.
They would take 73% of the land, and as a matter of fact, at the time, against all what people hear, the Arab countries did not actually attack Israel. And the matter of fact, it's only when Israel crossed those lines given to it by the United Nations and went into the territory of the West Bank, where Jordan was to have jurisdiction over the land, did the Jordanians clash with them. In 1967, the West Bank, as you often see on maps, was administered by the Jordanian government, and the Gaza Strip was administered by the Egyptian government. Israel would attack, would actually bomb the air force of Egypt, destroying all of their planes as a preemptive move. They would go in, they would take the Gaza Strip, they would take the Sinai Peninsula. At the end of that few days, Jordan would retaliate from its side. The Israelis would go into conflict with the Jordanians, would battle, would take over the complete West Bank to the Jordanian River, and then they would proceed to attack Syria, taking the Golan Heights. At the end of 1967, what we would have is the occupation of the rest of Palestine. And this is where you hear of the occupied territories. The rest of the Palestinians, and many of them, 350,000 of them during 1967, would be refugees again, would be expelled out of their homes and from their lands. And therefore, you now have this occupied territory of the Gaza Strip and West Bank, and then living under occupation, living under oppression, and the very difficult times. And maybe Ron, you can share with us what happens between 67 and up to the early 90s when you hear of the Oslo.
First, I'd like to ask, the United Nations had a role in the creation of the Jewish state Israel. What was their reaction in 1967 after the Six-Day War, after they took the occupied territories? I mean, the United Nations, a respected, kind of governing body. What was the reaction and what came of it?
Well, they passed a very clear resolution demanding that Israel withdraw from all territories seized by war. And here we are in the year 2000, and Israel has yet to abide by that resolution passed in 67. It still has yet to abide by resolutions passed in 48. It's been 52 years now, and Israel is still in violation of UN Security Council resolutions. To be specific, Israel is right now in violation of more than 70 United Nations Security Council resolutions and General Assembly resolutions up till today. So the United Nations response to the 67 war was very clear. Israel had committed a wrong, and it had to return the land that it seized.
But it hasn't.
It has not. It has done quite the contrary. It has done quite the contrary. I'm sure that many of the viewers remember when we saw the war in Yugoslavia, when we saw what happened to the people of Kosovo. We saw them, leaving their homes, and it was dramatic footage on television, and all our hearts went out to them. Well, our hearts as Palestinians really went out to them because it brought back our memories of what it was for us to be expelled from our homes at gunpoint, except with the people of Kosovo, the international community in some way stood by them. With us as Palestinians, the international community has not stood by us, it has betrayed us.
Thank you. So moving up closer in time, the Intifada in 1986, the uprising, and then the following Oslo process afterwards. Would you like to tell us about that?
Let me give some basis to that, and then maybe you can go through some of the difficult times. Under occupation, the Palestinians went through a very difficult time. Thousands of Palestinians would be jailed indiscriminately without process. Land would be annexed and taken by Israel. This was not a situation where Israel was going to pull out of this illegally occupied land. And in time, the Palestinians would uprise. In 80, 86, 87, up to 93, there would be something called the Intifada, where the Palestinians under the Israeli occupation and rule would stand up and would say, we will not listen to your rules. We're not going to abide by this process. And Israel had a situation on their hands where they could no longer control and had a very difficult time with even their own citizens justifying this occupation. And they needed a solution. And the solution was to have the Palestinians controlled and ruled by their own people come in the PLO. The PLO would come in under the premise, the basic agreement of the Oslo agreement, to facilitate Israel to withdraw from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and the return of the land and the creation of the state of Palestine. Unfortunately, this was not based on the United Nations resolutions, which is the true international law, were based on some basic hand-waving and agreement that didn't have any basis or commitment or verification. And unfortunately, the Oslo Agreement has turned out to be a disaster as to the specific outcomes, the realities of the Oslo Agreement, that maybe Rania can share some of them with us.
You know, they call the Oslo the peace process. And when I say I'm against the Oslo Agreement, the response is, my God, you're against the process for peace. And I say, no, I am for a peace process. I am for peace. But this so-called peace process that we hear about is not a process for peace. It is a process for injustice. It's a process of furthering occupation. Now, why do I say that? Because since the signing of Oslo, when was Oslo signed? Since the signing of Oslo 10 years ago, approximately 10 years ago, what has happened? Number one, the Security Council resolutions and international law dictates have been ignored. They have continued to be violated. We have seen a massive increase of settlements on Palestinian land. Now, what does that mean? That means that we have people coming in, confiscating Palestinian land, building homes on there, and not letting the Palestinians themselves live in their own land. We have seen more than 800 homes demolished. I want to show you a picture of what it means to have your home demolished. Now, this is a picture of one home in Palestine that has been demolished. Basically, what happens is a Palestinian family, you know, owning their own land, has to ask for permission from the Israeli occupying forces to build a home on their own land. This permit is never given. Now, let me repeat, they own this land, okay? Here's another picture. What happens is, when Israel does not give a permit to build a home on their own land, and this home is built anyway, the home is then demolished. These are very, very small homes, basically two-room homes, that are demolished. So imagine this if you were a Palestinian. In 48, you were kicked out of your home at gunpoint. In 67, you were kicked out of your home at gunpoint. And then when you try, very meagerly, to build a little home on a little plot of land that you have so that you and your very large family can live together, your home is demolished again. This is what we have happening under this so-called peace process. We have seen 15,000 Palestinian boys and girls being detained, which means an Israeli army will go into your home, take your little boy and put him in jail for no charge, with no trial, and keep him there for years, indefinitely. 15,000 since the signing of the Oslo peace process. We have seen increased segregation, increased destruction of Palestinian villages, increased forms of apartheid on Palestinians since the signing of Oslo. So this is no peace. A peace would be implementation of international law. A peace would be respecting Palestinians for their human rights, not violating them, not treating them as if they were not human. But this is what we have happening by the Israeli occupying forces to the Palestinians.
Thank you. A little bit more about the apartheid. Now, apartheid is a term many Americans we're familiar with South Africa, with the having to carry passes in and out of the country, the second-class citizenship, which isn't even nearly as bad as the demolition of actual homes and that sort of thing. But that's another concept that I think we can relate to. Can you give an idea of the types of apartheid that occurs in Palestine?
Okay, we have segregated roads. Okay, we have a road that's built on confiscated Palestinian land that a Palestinian car cannot go on. How will they know that you have a Palestinian car, not an Israeli car? Because we have different license plates, depending on if you are a Palestinian from one city, a Palestinian from another city, or an Israeli. So imagine you have different color license plates that define your ethnicity. Based on those license plates, you can travel on different roads. The good roads are for the Israelis, the dangerous roads are for the Palestinians. We have checkpoints that are set up. Checkpoint, you think, what's the big deal? You pass by a checkpoint. A checkpoint means that you may not get to go to work. You may not get to go to a hospital, even if you are a woman in labor having to go to hospital. We have had children dying in their own cars. Imagine a woman in labor and not being allowed to go to the hospital because she stopped at a checkpoint. She gives birth to twins and they die. This has happened so many times that it's a crime. It's unbelievable. segregation based on ethnicity. Like I said, in addition to home demolitions, we have land confiscations. We have misallocation of natural resources. You are a Palestinian in Gaza and the West Bank. You most likely do not have enough water to wash your dishes every day. You most likely do not have enough water to take a shower when you need one. But you look across the road at the newly built illegal Jewish settlements on your land, and they have a swimming pool. Now imagine, this is what we talk about when we talk about misallocation of natural resources. And these are all examples of apartheid, all examples of segregation based on ethnicity, based on the way that you choose to worship God.
Salam, maybe I can give a little bit of basis for all of this. What happened after 67 is that the Israelis had occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. They have their eyes set to occupy and to own the rest of this land. And their solution to all of this was to try to contain the Palestinians in the land, in the constricted small regions that they were living in. And therefore, anybody that attempted to live outside this land would ask for permission, would ask for a grant to build their home. It would never be allowed by the Israeli government. It was not given in 33 years. The Palestinians would go ahead and build their homes, and then the Israeli government would come in at some point and would pull them out early in the morning, and they would demolish their home. 2,650 homes have been demolished since '87 in just the West Bank alone. And then they would create settlements. This is coming in and annexing thousands of acres of land in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. 40% of Gaza is an Israeli settlement. The other 60% of Gaza, 1 million people live on. The Israeli settlements house 3,000 to 4,000 Israelis. And the same thing goes on in the West Bank. Huge roads, freeways facilitating the connection of the settlements into Israel proper and segregating the Palestinians, while they're constricted in controlled areas by the Israeli military, and people are not allowed to travel or to move literally between these Bantustans, as you refer to, Salam. And here we have the making of apartheid.
Yes.
I see. Well, you've again painted a very vivid picture of what's going on, and I think we now have a clear picture of what apartheid is and how it is taking place in Israel, and not just in South Africa. It's not even happening there anymore. They managed to put a stop to that. Let's now talk about what you said about how they're controlling, with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO came in, can kind of act as like a figurehead of government to help control the Palestinians for the Israeli government. You brought up that. I want to explore that topic a little bit further.
Well, Salam, imagine this. Imagine Israel again. They have millions of people that are uprising, that are under occupation, that need to be controlled in some way because their land is being confiscated, they're being taxed without being provided services, their infrastructures are falling apart. These are people that are living in such intensely bad conditions that they will not stop for it. And this is where you see Palestinians trying to throw stones. That's all they can do is throw stones, and they are called terrorists for it. So the answer is the most effective way of controlling a people is to pay others, pay an organization of that people to control them. Promise them that they will, if they would control their own people and suppress all of this violence, that their land would be returned to them slowly in a process that would take some years with supposedly, strict rules of enforcement and security for Israel. But at the end, after 7-10 years, this has not happened. The Palestinians are literally oppressed by their own government. Now there's a double oppression, and you can try to justify somehow that the PLO, of course the PLO again and again would be blamed for any clashes, for any uprising by the Palestinians. Clinton would get up on TV and say, Yasser Arafat has to control these people. Yasser Arafat, Barack will again complain that Yasser Arafat needs to control his own people. They're being violent. We can never have peace. But the answer to the peace process is the continuous confiscation of land. There are 400,000 Israelis now living illegally on the West Bank. They are annexing and growing Jerusalem so that it can have a larger and larger majority of Israelis. The way they do this is they build settlements in the West Bank and they enlarge Jerusalem to say that, well, Jerusalem is really all Jewish. They do it in all kinds of ways. They do it, and the amazing thing, the really amazing cap in all of this is that lots of money is being spent on facilitating these settlements. They are beautiful homes. They are planned communities. They bring in lots of water and lush vegetation. And the amazing thing at the end is that us Americans are paying for all of this. We are subsidizing it in volumes. Maybe Rania can share some of that with us.
Well, imagine this, okay? We as American taxpayers, while we have our social welfare is being cut in this country, while we have our education loans are being cut, while we have 1 in 6 American children do not have health insurance and go hungry every night as they go to sleep, 1 in 6, while we have all these problems taking place in our own country, here in the United States, we have our administration spending more money per capita on Israelis than it is spending on Americans. Now, as an American, I find that completely outrageous. As an Arab American, I find it even more outrageous that our administration, instead of fulfilling its vows to support democracy, to support freedom, to support human rights, as it always claims to be, is instead supporting a state that justifies sending Apache helicopters, tanks, sharpshooters, high-velocity ammunition, and numerous other very intensive military weaponry to kill children armed with stones. This is the state that our administration is supporting. We are supporting them with billions of dollars annually to pay for their military, to pay for their economy, which, by the way, Israel is among the top 10 countries in the world that spies on us as Americans. They spy on us. This is not quite an ally here. We are funding the illegal settlement, we are funding the illegal land confiscations, we are funding the destruction and the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. Let me remind you, 70% of all Palestinians are refugees. 70% of all Palestinians cannot go home. 70% of all Palestinians are living a life in exile. This is a very difficult life to lead. The rest of the Palestinians are living a life under occupation.
Regarding the occupation and the land that the Palestinians do have, how is that set up and why is that not a good foundation for forming a Palestinian state?
Well, here's what you have, Salam. Essentially, as I explained before, they are trying to constrict the Palestinians to as small of a region of land as they can feasibly execute or have occur. And at the end, what this is these are little islands. They are spread out all over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Their borders are controlled by the Israeli military. The occupants, the residents of these regions are giving ID cards that are specific to that Bantustan. Therefore, you have to have permission. Within the tens of miles of that region, you are free to roam. But if you are to try to leave that area, you have to have permission. And then you have to ask for specific permission to go to what region you want. Particularly Jerusalem, they allow very little travel into Jerusalem as they focus very hard on the ethnic cleansing and the removal of the Palestinian residents of Jerusalem. And you can see, you find this in ID confiscation. If you are captured and thrown in jail, if you there's any implications on you in any way, they will say, well, we will let you go, but you have to give up your ID card and you have to leave Jerusalem. This is amazingly illegal and immoral. And what you now have is you have a culture, you have a country, you have a state that does not have contiguous borders, that its borders are constricted in islands by an enemy, by an occupier, and therefore the economy is in shambles. At any moment, at any time, Israel has these what are so-called closures, which you may hear about on the news, where they constrict, they close the borders, no movement in and out. The people have a very difficult time with rations. As you've seen recently, they will even bomb them until the Palestinians suppress and are close to death, and then they will let them go. And this is just to let them know that this is how they will live, and if there is any uprising or response from them, these are the consequences of it. And there will never be a peace. There is no peace in the peace process. This is a very important message. There's illegalities, there are United Nations resolutions that are not being upheld for 33 and 52 years. People cannot, there's no feasible way of having a Palestinian state. Today, the access roads for these settlements crisscross Palestine in an amazing way. It's like a crossword puzzle. It's like a puzzle. And Palestinians cannot cross these roads. Of course, these roads are about a football field wide. And then Israel says, well, we also need another football field and a half on each side for security purposes. Of course, this is all illegal annexed land. And then they build these huge, beautiful freeways that only go between Israel and these settlements. And they crisscross the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and no longer can Palestinians connect easily between these Bantustans. There is no peace in this peace process. We can discuss the realities of what could happen at the end, but today and the process is never going to be working, regardless of whether the PLO has any sort of agreement with the Israeli government.
Well, a lot of the things we've been talking about today, why haven't I seen this sort of thing on the news? When I flip on my television, I see a very different picture. I don't generally see so many of the Palestinian homes being demolished. I don't see Palestinian children being killed. I see a couple Israeli soldiers being killed. I hear about that a lot. Why is what we're talking about today seems so foreign to me, as as an American who watches the NBC nightly news and sees something completely different?
Well, ironically, you'll hear more about Israeli violations of Palestinian human rights in the Israeli press than you will hear about them in the American press, which is really unbelievable. And there are several reasons why you don't hear about them. Palestinians are Arabs, and you don't hear about the death of Arabs anywhere in the American press because Arabs are denigrated. We're regarded as Arabs, as numerous other things that I cannot voice on public television. We are regarded as less than human, basically. Our deaths are not regarded as newsworthy. So Palestinians have the misfortune to be Arabs. On top of that, we have the American press in general completely abides with whatever foreign policy the US administration has. It rarely questions it, whatever the foreign policy is, ranging from Colombia to Palestine across the board. So when we have the US administration stating and justifying the massive use of Israeli violence against Palestinians, which, by the way, Amnesty International has declared that the Israeli use of violence in September and October of 2000, just recently, their use of violence against Palestinians is regarded as a war crime by Amnesty International. When we have the US administration justifying this, we will not have the American press talking about we have that 51 Palestinian children under the age of 17 have been killed, that more than 160 Palestinians have been killed, that 4,500 Palestinians have been injured, most of them with fatal wounds, this occurring in a matter of 26 days. We don't hear about that. And what we need to have is our administration being true to its word. We need to have our administration being true to its conscience. And we need to have our media being true to journalistic integrity.
Well, we've covered now extensively, I think, or at least touched and given a good overview of some history and the present situation of what's going on. But now I'd really like to talk about the future. Where can we go from here? What are our options? Is there hope for peace? Is there hope for a Palestinian state? What are the solutions?
Well, I am a peace activist. I believe in peace, and I believe that there is hope in peace, or else I would not be devoting my life to this issue. There are three options for the future for Palestinians and Israelis, because our future is tied. We are both tied to the same land. The first is that the US administration will continue to support the State of Israel, therefore leading more land confiscations, more segregations, therefore having in the future, the very soon future, a complete occupation of all Palestinian land and basically a state of apartheid in the land of Palestine, where Israelis are given rights and Palestinians are not, where we will have another South Africa in the Middle East. That's option number one, if we as Americans do not do anything to change the situation. Option number two is having a two-state solution in the land of Palestine. Basically would mean the Israelis would have to abide by international law, respect UN Security Council resolutions, and withdraw from all lands seized by war. Therefore, they have to withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza and Jerusalem, as dictated by international law. You will have one Palestinian state right next to an Israeli state. And it has to be enforced that all Palestinian refugees have the right to return and have the right of compensation as dictated by international law. This is what the Jews who were evicted from Europe because of the Nazi reign are asking for, and this is what we are asking for. Now, the third option is a one-state solution, where we have all the land controlled under one government, all of it. You can call it Israel, you can call it Palestine, you can call it whatever you want. It's a one-state solution. But the catch here is that regardless how you choose to worship God, whether you are a Jew, a Christian, a Muslim, a Buddhist, an atheist, however way you choose to worship God and whatever your religious background, you will be given the same rights under law as anyone else in that country, which is what we as Americans believe very strongly in. We believe in the separation of religion from government, and that is what we are asking for the Israeli leaders to do, to separate religion from government, to treat all people equally. And furthermore, all Palestinian refugees must have the right to go home. There is nothing as fundamental as the right to go home, and that is what we are asking for. So those are the three options. We as Americans can either work for peace and work for either a true two-state solution or a one-state solution where all rights are respected, or we can do nothing and watch the further ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, the further breeding of violence, because there will be further violence completely in the future until we have justice. It is really in our hands, because we are the ones who are supplying Israel with the majority of the money. We are the ones who are backing Israel the most in the world, and we are the superpower in the world. It is basically what we say goes. So let's say the right thing.
Thank you. I'd like to thank both of you for coming today. But before we close and end, what do we want to end with? A message, something to tie it all together, an image for us as Americans to have. What should we think about when we think about Palestine and Israel? Can you help us with that?
I want you, when you think of Palestinians, to think of a proud people, a dignified people who have been violated for 52 years, a people who are asking only for the right to live equally with all the rights afforded to them under international law, to live as human beings. That is basically all that we are asking for, and that is all that we want. If I could also, I want to read this one poem to you. It's a poem about what it means to be a refugee, written by a noted Palestinian poet. And I want to end with this poem because, like I said, 70% of all Palestinians are refugees. We cannot go home, 70% of us. This poem says, "Now I live in tent number 50 on the left, but it's too small for my future. Forget, they tell me, but how can I forget? The night when dreams stop showing me my village, when the wind stops bringing me the perfume of the fruit in my garden, when it stops raining from the sky, then I will be able to stop thinking about my country." That is what it means to be a refugee, to be kept away from your homeland, to be kept away from your roots, to be living without an identity, to be living in a country. We are scattered around the world. Most of the places we do not have the rights afforded to us. For the Palestinians who are living under occupation, basically 30% of the population living under occupation, they are living with no rights. At any moment, the Israeli military may step into their homes and take their children, put them into detention, may massacre them, as we've seen happening throughout September and October of this year, where we've had the Israeli military attack them with grenades, with tanks, with missiles, with sniper bullets, with high-velocity ammunition. What it means to live as a Palestinian means to live with no guarantee for tomorrow, to live every day as it may be your last, not knowing when you may be killed, not knowing when you may be expelled from your home.
Salam, as a Palestinian, it's one really is in despair and in disbelief, and really has a very difficult time believing in something called destiny or justice or equality, because here you are as an individual that is completely humiliated, your rights taken away from you, your relatives killed, and at the end of all of it, you are blamed for it. I, as a Palestinian trying to go back to my homeland, will be searched, will be interrogated, will be spied upon, will be humiliated. And this is a land that my mother, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, my ancestors for years have lived in that land. While I know simultaneously the Israeli government pursues Jews living in corners of this world, Russians are coming in to Israel, provided citizenship, and they are living in comfort and subsidies. I think this is of the utmost supreme immorality of the world, and I think it's time us as Americans step in and say no to it.
Well, thank you for joining us for this very special feature of International Eyes. Stay focused. Thank you.
Thank you, Sana.